Hey fearsome friends, my laptop is now working and I'm happily back to work. Thank you all for your patience and support. Tonight's episode, there's lots of stories about shadow people, very spooky, but also stories of demonic possession and the reckless use of the occult. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I've never really been a big believer in all this paranormal stuff, and this is my first time even being on this subreddit. But I really wanted to share what I experienced last night, because it's truly left an impression on me, and I'm looking for answers. Let me start by explaining the layout of my house. I was sat on my living room couch, which is about 8 meters away from the doorway that leads into the hallway. It is sideways to the door, so even if it is directly in front of it, you would have to turn your head 90 degrees to the right to look at the door. The doorway itself is at the far right of the hallway, so if you were to turn right, you'd hit a wall, and if you turn left, you'd continue into the hallway. It was around 10:30 p.m, and I was watching YouTube on the TV. I was browsing through my recommended videos, when I thought I heard someone walking out of the hallway and going into the kitchen, which is to the left of the doorway. I live with my mother and sister, who is visiting from college, so this isn't something unusual. It's common, in fact, so I didn't even look towards the sound to see what was up. I continued browsing YouTube, not even thinking about who had walked past, when I heard a loud thump coming from down the hallway around where my sister's room would be. It sounded like something had fallen over, so this is when I decided to turn my head towards the door and call out to my sister. Then I saw it, standing in the doorframe. It was this pitch-black, freakishly tall figure. It was so tall that half of what would have been its head was above the top of the doorframe and out of sight. I never managed to call out to my sister, since I was frozen in shock. I have only ever felt fear for my life a handful of times before, but the feeling I got then was like nothing I've ever felt. Looking at this thing, I was completely paralyzed with fear. I sat completely still and in shock for what felt like for hours, staring at whatever the hell this thing was, not moving even a bit. It had the shape of a human, but it was just entirely black. No clothes, no features, just a pitch-black figure. Just then, when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the thing started moving. It turned away from me and started walking down the hallway. I wanted to scream out, because I knew that at least one of my family members was over in that part of the house, but I just couldn't move. I was shaking and sweating, terrified beyond my mind. It's not something that's easy to describe. I was half expecting my mum or sister to let out a scream, but it was completely silent. At this point, I didn't want to call out to anybody, in fear that they would respond and alert whatever that thing was of where we were, or even worse, come out of their rooms and cross paths with it. I decided to creep my way over to the hallway to get to my sister's room and see if she was there. So shaking, I peeked out through the doorframe, and at that point the whole situation just seemed like a horror movie. I didn't see the black figure or anybody in the hallway, but I saw the light on in my sister's room. Not wanting to move even a foot forward, I called out to my sister, who responded without issue. I asked if she was okay, and she answered yes, although I could tell she was confused as to why I was asking. My mum was in the room with her the whole time apparently, so no one had actually gone into the kitchen. I was terrified for the rest of the night, and I'm really considering whether I've gone insane. But it all just felt so real. Like the fear for my life I felt was 100% genuine. I'm writing this the night after, and I haven't seen, heard, or felt anything since then. It goes without saying that I didn't sleep well that night, and I'm still afraid of going to bed tonight as well. Has anybody experienced something similar, or have any ideas on what the hell I saw? Or am I just going crazy? I'm not a strong believer, nor a skeptic, but I'm open for any kind of explanation of what I might have encountered here. This happened years back when I was about 9 or 10. I'm 27 now, and my family used to live in a government-owned goat farm as a caretaker vet for the goats they keep there. It's a thing in my country in Southeast Asia, not sure if it is anywhere else. The area is pretty huge, with the only way in or out being through a lone road with a steel double gate which is usually locked at night. It's also pretty secluded, only 2 families living in it, and comprised mostly of thick forest. One night my family, Mum, Dad and older sister and I, were in our car and on our way home from a prayer meeting at church. It was around 11 p.m. at the time, and as per usual practice, my dad stopped his car just after the metal gate and got out to lock it. My mum's sister and I were in the car minding our business, and that's when I noticed a strange ball of light floating straight ahead on the dark road, just slightly beyond where the car headlights reached. If I remember correctly, the size was a bit smaller than a football. I quickly told my mum and sister, and they were equally puzzled. My dad had seen it as well, as it just floated there while we were watching. And after a while it moved closer to the ground, before vanishing without a trace. We told a few of the workers at the farm about our experience that night, and most of them said they'd never seen it. But one of the guys, from the other family that stayed there, had had a somewhat similar experience. He told us that one night he and another friend went out to town and came back late in the evening, but the gate was locked earlier than usual, and he'd forgotten his key. So he decided to climb over the gate and walk to his house to fetch it, which is close to around a 5-kilometer walk, passing a few goat paddocks. His friend waited in the car outside the gate and turned the engine off to save on fuel, which put him in complete darkness. After a while, he saw flickers of light, similar to fire from a lighter, coming towards him from the other side of the gate. He thought maybe it was just the other guy, and his torchlight had run out of juice, so he switched on the car headlights to help. But to his surprise, nobody was there. The friend told the worker about the lights afterwards, but he just brushed it off, until he heard our story. By then, we were pretty sure it was something paranormal. Strangely, it actually happened a few more times after the first sighting, usually around the time similar to the first one. My parents decided not to make a big deal of it, since it's in our local belief that we have to respect those things. People say that it's a spirit of the forest. Plus, it wasn't causing any harm to us. Then one night my dad came back late alone, and as usual went to lock the gate. When he got back inside the car, he saw the light again. Then my dad whispered something that went along the lines of, "Look, we both want peace here. Why don't you leave this place alone and go back to where you came from? We're sorry if we did you any harm." He followed it with a few prayers. Then as usual, the light moved a few inches close to the ground, then vanished. Since then, the light hasn't appeared. Until this day, that is. And I still have no clue what it is. When talking about my childhood, a few years ago my dad referenced something about me that still gives me chills to this day. I've moved a good amount, about 3 times cross-country, so I don't have a super clear memory of the houses and friends I've met along the way. Especially the memories from when I was a toddler. It's kind of a jumble. But I lived in the same house from when I was born to when I was about 5 years old. I was also kind of a creepy child, and it's mostly my dad who has told me stories of when I was pretty young and would have moments that just seemed off. For example, my dad's side of the family, including himself and myself, are pretty Catholic. My dad would occasionally talk about the gospel, Jesus, and God, and I would nod along. But as he finished teaching, I would reply with really profound words of the gospel or insights about God and heaven that were unusual for a toddler. I can't give any specific examples because my dad couldn't remember word for word, but he said that it caught him off guard, and that I also told my parents that some people were scary, even though they appeared completely normal, but then they turned out to be pretty despicable or insane. I also apparently, a couple of times, said without hesitation an exact thought that one of my parents was thinking. When I was around 4 years old, there was a month where I had these terrifying reoccurring dreams almost every night. While I don't have a good memory, I can confirm this because my dad told me that almost every morning I would go downstairs and talk about a visit from the Silver Man. He was called that because I remember him to be completely white and grey, with some sort of glow. Except he didn't light up the dark surroundings of my bedroom. The glow just kind of dissipated into the air. He had some defining features, one of them being the way he dressed. He wore a fedora and cardigan, I think, and he dressed like a slightly fashionable old man. He had no facial hair, and he was thin and definitely older, maybe in his 80s or even older. I only have fragments of memories, but I remember that he would come into my room and tease me, spit on me, etc., while I hid under the covers. It wasn't sleep paralysis, because I remember moving. I just never left the safety of my bed. It scares me to this day, and I have no idea what it was. And despite me kind of obsessing over this, I never had another dream like the ones in that random month when I was 4. When I brought up the fact that the Silver Man wore a fedora, my dad immediately said that my great-grandfather wore the exact same kind of clothes that the man wore. My great-grandfather died shortly after I was born, and because my dad was on the West Coast, caring for my mother who had just given birth to me, he hadn't had a chance to say goodbye to his dying grandfather in person. Maybe that's some sort of explanation for the dreams. I was hesitant to post this, but decided to because I'm very curious to hear what you guys think. What do you think of the dreams of toddlers? Was it my imagination, or was this a visitation dream? Was this something malicious? I would appreciate your thoughts and potential explanations, paranormal and non-paranormal alike. Now, everything I'm about to tell you has been going on for several years, but it has ended since I moved in with my boyfriend a year and a half ago. It starts in 2010, when my grandmother died, whom I loved more than anything. She had a wooden wardrobe in the back of her hallway that was centuries old and had even survived a fire. I hated it. I was very afraid of it, and I ran whenever I had to pass in front of it because it terrorized me. The problem is, though, that this wardrobe ended up in my room. At the beginning, it was impossible for me to sleep. I'd look at it constantly, and when I did manage to fall asleep, I had many nightmares. The one thing I remember from that time is that I was woken up in the middle of the night by a toy that lit up in the middle of my room. A Winx Bloom doll, to be precise, and this was after I'd put the doll away on my desk before going to bed. By then I'd started to realize that something was wrong, When I got to high school, it was then I'd started to realize that something was wrong. I'd hear voices, laughter, and objects were changing places by themselves. I also learned at the same time that my grandmother had been a clairvoyant. My nights from then on became more and more disrupted. I'd have sleep paralysis and see a black shape jumping on me. I was also woken up in the middle of the night by a man to who I wanted to talk to. It was getting worse and worse. But the worst thing that happened to me was when I was bickering with my older brother. I found myself in my bathroom, which was very scary as the door closed by itself or even slammed shut, so you were totally in the dark. I thought my brother was with me, because I felt hands pulling me down to the floor and grabbing my shins, but I'd scream loudly and my brother would open the door from the outside. My family never believed me. They thought I'd made it all up. And coming from a religious family, I'm not at all really surprised. Since that day, I started to communicate with the spirits by protecting myself, and I realized that the cupboard in my room had brought me 2 spirits. The first one, a rather nice man who used to stay in my room, and the second is a malevolent woman who is in my bathroom. These days things are much better, and I don't have any more problems. So let me start off by saying that I am a huge horror movie fan and have seen all the major horror movies out there. I pretty much only ever watch horrors in my spare time, and like watching anything paranormal. I find it very hard to be genuinely scared, and most horrors don't really scare me. So I was looking for a decent movie to watch, and I'm mostly into demonic paranormal horrors, when I came across a movie called The Dark and the Wicked. I looked it up on IMDb, and it had a fairly good rating, so I thought I'd give it a try. I started watching it around 1 a.m, and after it had finished I thought, wow, that actually was a really scary movie. That doesn't happen often, and it freaked me out a bit. My wife was sleeping, and I quietly and carefully got into bed as to not wake her up, but she woke up anyway and asked me what time it was. It was almost 3 a.m. I told her I'd watched a really scary movie and it freaked me out, but she pretty much told me to shut up and go to sleep. She can't watch or listen to anything remotely scary. Then 20 minutes or so later, and I was in bed still trying to sleep, when all of a sudden I heard an alarm go off. Initially I was thinking it was coming from my neighbor's house, but it sounded closer. My wife woke up and she said it could be the car alarm, but I looked outside and it wasn't, so I thought I'd go downstairs to check it out. It was our fire alarm. I put the light on and went to the kitchen and there was no smoke. Then I went into the living room and there was no smoke in there either. All the appliances were off too. So at that point I didn't think much of it, turned the alarm off and went back to bed. I told my wife and she didn't make anything of it either. So I tried to go back to sleep again, when after 30 minutes or so, it went off again. I did the same thing, looked all around the house, but there was no smoke, nothing. I had no explanation for it. I took the fire alarm off the ceiling and checked if the battery was low, as this is one of the reasons why it would go off. But this particular fire alarm, you can't change the battery, and it had an expiry date that ended in 2028. I didn't put the fire alarm back on the ceiling and just threw it in the bin. I went back to bed, and needless to say my wife was pissed, and she said, "I always tell you not to watch these types of movies at night." Now we are Muslim, and she thinks that if you watch movies with demonic stuff in it, it can bring negative energy to the house. I thought that was nonsense, but after that day, I have had second thoughts. I'm still going to watch horror movies, I just find it crazy how we have lived in this house for 3 years and nothing like this has ever happened before. It could just be a coincidence, but it made me think. I've had friends who have told me that similar things have happened to them in the past. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you feel that watching scary, paranormal, demonic stuff can bring negative energy to your house? Have you had any similar experiences? So I have been pondering about writing this, and have exhausted avenues trying to find correlating stories to match mine. So hopefully someone may have a similar experience to share. I'm 32, a mum of 3 boys, and as you can guess, I'm no party animal. No drink or drugs, or have any mental health issues that I know of. I'm from the UK, specifically England, and moved from Birmingham City to a small country village. When we moved, I had no stress or upset and was quite liking the relaxed and dead quiet culture. 3 weeks into moving, I dropped my 2 eldest off to school and came back home with my 1-year-old, and due to him having a broken night's sleep, we snuggled into bed and drifted off. Moments later, I heard what sounded like my front door opening, and I woke up startled. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for more noise, before I would react, and it sounded like someone was literally power running up the stairs. Then I felt like someone was standing in the doorframe, staring down at me. As I looked in my peripheral vision, I could make out the dark silhouette of what I've come to know now as the Shadow Man with a top hat. Everything went dead quiet, like I'd paused time, and I slowly pulled the quilt up over my face and rooted around with my hand to find my phone, which felt like I was going in slow motion. I could see my youngest son fast asleep under the quilt with me, and then a bright light shine over the quilt, like the sun through curtains, and it felt like someone had clicked their fingers and the dread feeling and noise snapped away. I slowly looked up at the door, because I was poking my pants at this point, and no one was there. I walked around the house and checked the door, but nothing was out of place. Over the next 6 to 12 months, strange things happened. My partner needed a haircut, and we could not locate the clippers for 3 months, so bought a new pair, after we'd given up looking. But then they appeared in the garage on a table, the very place we'd have walked past millions of times. And our boiler kept turning down, and that was also in the garage. I questioned the kids, and it's not a room that they had ready access to, and would need a chair to reach the bar to physically turn the pressure down. But this happened a lot, so I had the boiler man come out, and he said all was fine. One evening my partner sat eating his dinner, and the dining room door handle physically pushed down, and the door opened like someone had just walked in. Mid-argument with our eldest for not tidying his room, a beaker bottle, the type with the straw and twist top, flew off the side and was upside down on the floor with the juice still intact with the floor holding the juice in. We all just stared at each other, and I repeatedly asked my son if he'd pushed it off as he walked past. But even if he had, the way it was on the floor was not natural. Now I didn't feel threatened, which I know sounds crazy now I'm writing this, and these things happened within months of each other, but then would cease to happen for a while. But the scariest occurrence, I've looked for similar accounts, haunts me to this day. It was on a night where we'd gone to bed, and my partner had fallen asleep. I turned on my side in the dark to get comfy, when I heard what I can only describe as someone in shiny jogging bottoms literally bolting it around my partner's side of the bed. It was a fast whooshing sound, and I actually braced myself, as if one of my kids was about to jump on the bed, which they've never done. And it was close to midnight, and I hadn't even heard the door open. As I slowly pulled my duvet up, I was looking all around the room, but couldn't see anything. and I was too scared of what I might see, to be honest. I rationalized that it was just me being silly, and maybe I was tired, when all of a sudden my bed was pushed from my side to the other side of the room and back about 4 times, powerfully. This was not some little tremor feeling. This was full throttle, pushing and pulling. I jumped up and screamed, and my partner started leaping up too. Then it all just stopped. We sat for half an hour with the light on, discussing what had happened and how impossible it would have been to do what had just happened. We have a solid built bed, an extremely thick Tempur kind of mattress, and the floor was carpeted. Not to mention our body weights in the bed also. We were spooking ourselves and checked in on the boys, and all was fine. I told my partner I would not be going to sleep without the light on, and he turned over and fell asleep. Moments later, something banged from the other side of the wall above my headboard, as if running past and punching the wall heavily a few times, tauntingly. I screamed again, and my partner said he hadn't heard anything, as he'd fallen asleep. It took me several hours and the light on, but I've managed to fall asleep until the morning. We stayed there for another 2 years and nothing happened after that. We've since moved, but I often wonder why something would do this, and if anyone had had a similar thing happen. Since this experience, I've never had anything like this happen to me again, and I still remember the force of the bed moving. While in college, I spent many late nights in a lab and would often walk home at around 1 or 2 a.m. down silent sidewalks lit only by scattered streetlights. Now, not every night, but often enough. 1 or more streetlights would turn off as I approached or walked under them. Some would turn back on as I walked away, and I just figured it might have something to do with some sort of sensor that some of my classmates had also experienced. But they hadn't, and they didn't believe me about it either. So I dropped it and hadn't discussed it further with anyone until recently, which was nearly 10 years later. It's happened on and off for the past 10 years, whether walking or driving down a dark street. Street lights or outdoor house lights will turn on or off. Some will flicker as I approach, and one recent light was flashing to a specific rhythm, over and over again. I don't know Morse code, but my first thought was that it seemed to be flashing a message or something. I am far from convinced it was a code, but it sure seemed like it was at the time. The one pattern that I've noticed is that it seems to happen more frequently when I'm stressed or depressed, or otherwise in a heightened emotional state. Since my aunt, my closest family member, died a few months back, it has been happening with a noticeably increasing frequency. Like it seems to happen at least once every time I'm out and about in the dark. And not just the same lights. I'm talking different house lights and street lights across the city. I'm well aware of confirmation bias, and I'm very skeptical myself. But it's gone on too long to be a coincidence. I've heard different explanations to debunk the so-called streetlight interference phenomenon, or SLI, which is a name for this experience that I found from Google. For instance, light bulbs nearing the end of their life go out unexpectedly and so on. But I can assure you, as someone who's been skeptical of any sort of paranormal explanation for most of the 10 years that I've experienced this, that faulty wiring or a faulty bulb is not an explanation for this experience. So I'm sharing to see if anyone out here has had similar experiences, or if anyone has any explanations for why this specifically happens to me and no one else that I know. I'd really like to better understand it, but I've not found much info, except a little bit on the SLI theory. I experienced a terrifying haunting for months when I was 18 years old and still living at my parents' house. This story could be useful for anyone reckless enough to dabble in the occult without protecting yourself. For context, it was the month of February, a cold, dark Canadian winter. I was between 2 sessions of uni, switching programs, so I had a full 4 months with nothing to do. I'd also just broken up with my borderline crazy girlfriend and had tried to leave her after 6 months of abuse and her trying to kill herself, which she succeeded, since she died twice at the hospital, but she miraculously survived after weeks in a coma. I was left scarred and traumatized because of all of this, and angry and bitter at life, because I really wanted this relationship and had done everything I could to help her in vain. She leached and sucked out every possible positive vibe I had. But anyway, that's another story, although it is important to this one, as I have felt so dark and my energy was negative in this period of my life. I dabbled in the occult at this time, still skeptical, but determined by all means to prove to myself that it was all real. I read the Keys of Solomon, researched about many demons, famous cases, incantations and the occult in general. When one night, after focusing on Solomon, I asked out loud in my room to prove to me it was all real. Now I am not kidding when I tell you that the activity started that same night. I turned off the light, went under the covers, and that's when I felt a weight at my feet and someone sitting on my bed. I was shaken, but still under the impression I was just too into it and was hallucinating. But from then on it went from bad to worse. I started to hear whispers in my room, like 2 people hushing each other. My dog, which always slept with me, would wake up frightened as soon as I would close the light, and leave my room growling. It would always start with the weight, then the whispers, then stuff being knocked off my counters. If I would put a pillow on my ears, I would feel it lift from them, like a hand pulling it from my head. I started to sleep with earplugs, but would hear scratching inside my mattress, and my bed would slightly shake. My fan was knocked on the ground, and it culminated to both my closet doors opening violently. I would feel so oppressed. I could feel that something bad was going to happen. Then bang. I was terrified to go to sleep, and I would feel the oppressive energy start as soon as it would get dark. I was under the impression the parasites that I invited in were here to frighten me and leech on me. I never had sleep paralysis, except once in this bedroom, after a dream where a possessed priest was standing on my bed with his hands cuffed by a chain on the ceiling and screaming. I was there to fight him, and I saw the spirit leave its body and come straight for me. I got paralyzed against my closet doors and felt it trying to creep inside. I woke up paralyzed, trying to move, but thankfully broke out of it. It lasted for months, and I tried to cleanse my room, but nothing would work. I left my parents' house and was terrified it would follow me. It didn't though, thank goodness. Be safe, everyone. Don't invite anything into your world, and do not open doors that you don't know how to close. This happened in 2001 when I was 13. The foster family I had just moved into with was selling one of 2 old people's homes that they owned, and this particular one just so happened to be supposedly placed on the boundary lines of the old Templar kingdom of Walsingham. Not my words, but my foster mother's. As it was located in a rough area of Leeds, Yorkshire, after all residents were moved to different care homes, staff laid off, before the sale completed and money changed hands, my then foster mother, her ex-care home manager and friend, and myself decided to spend the night to make sure all cleaning was done, all items, knickknacks removed by removals, and that there was no damage to the property, etc. The initial plan was for me to sleep in a camp bed in the living room, and my foster mother and her friend to sleep in a nearby ground floor room. Upon pulling into the driveway, I got this feeling that I can only explain as a bad vibe. Spidey sense, neck hairs tingling. It was mid-October, and we were in early evening darkness. I got out of the car and upon walking up to the front door, saw what seemed to be a black cloud or amalgamation of darkness moving through the living room window, correlating in the left-hand corner of the room. This furthering my bad vibes, I stuck close to my foster mother and her friend, as we all did the basic chores before bed. As the room they were sleeping in had twin beds and was quite big, I asked if I could sleep on the floor, so as to not be on my own, and surprisingly they agreed. The TV was on until it was time to sleep, and my foster mother and her friend were asleep fast. I was drifting in and out, and I'm not sure what time it was, and lying on my left side with my right ear on the pillow, I heard a loud sniffling and could feel something breathing on my ear. As I opened my eyes slowly, it was then I heard a loud, inhuman, blood-curdling scream of a woman. I imagine it was a woman, as it was too high-pitched for a man. Then complete silence. My eyes opened and I jolted up, terrified. What was 30 seconds looking at both foster mother and her friend sound asleep seemed like an eternity as I screamed, "What the hell?" My foster mother and her friend then woke up to me in tears, explaining the scream that I'd heard. They did their best to console me and told me to go back to bed and we'd talk about it in the morning. But I could not get back to sleep. All I could do was try and rationalize what had happened. Yet I could hear a faint clanging sound coming from beneath the floorboards, almost like someone was mining. To be fair, the next morning during last-minute chores and waiting for removals, we all listened intently and tried to rationalize and make light of the ordeal whilst consoling me. Eventually, they tried to make a joke of it, as they knew by now how I looked that I was telling the truth, which worked after a few days. After we left the next day, and after any papers were signed, I was told that apparently other staff had heard the same things over the 20 years it had been a care home. I found out that a rich family had bought the place to be used as a family home, and I remember 2 weeks after this ordeal, and calming down, I asked if the new owners were told it was haunted. I got a grin and a maybe. If anybody lived in an ex-care home in Leeds, UK, once called Walsingham, a big old house, and had the scare of a lifetime, all I can say is sorry. My son just told me that he had left his door open a crack for the cat, whilst he stayed up late playing video games. And around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., he looked and saw a white face with no nose, no ears, no hair, and with scratches. He said its eyes and mouth were scrambled, and that the mouth was kind of small. It was looking in through the crack of the door, and when he looked it moved to the side and out of view. Then he quickly went and shut the door, and when I went to wake him up this morning, his door was locked. I managed to unlock it with my fingernail, when I noticed there was a fork stuck in his carpet in an attempt to block the door better. He'd been under stress from our dogs being missing for 3 days, and I told him that sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations. But he is positive somehow that it wasn't a hallucination, although I'm not sure how one would know a hallucination is real or not. But I don't think he was that sleep deprived. I've never actually hallucinated from sleep deprivation myself, and I've stayed up 49 plus hours in a row for work before. He also said he sees shadows out of the corner of his eyes, and honestly, I have no doubt that he saw either of these things. I believe him 100%. My son and I have experienced unexplained knocking in this house during the middle of the night. I've heard 2 taps on the window, and he and I both heard something running and stomping up the stairs, then finding nothing there immediately after. His dad and I saw shadow people in our old apartment, which I saw directly 2 feet away from me in a very sunny setting, fully awake and sober, as I was just sitting on the porch. My first question is, what could this be? Ghost? Demon? Something else? And at this point I'm wondering if maybe I should be worried after all. I want to add that a few days after we'd heard the running stomping up the stairs, we tried to replicate the sound for my husband, and neither of us could run fast enough while stomping that hard. I asked my son more about how it looked, and he said the scratches on his face were more like gashes, and that he could see through the gashes and the eyes, and the neck was very long, and he couldn't see any shoulders. Any ideas? So this story took place when I was 6 years old. I don't remember the incident itself, but I do remember that day, some of what happened and that trip. My parents have retold the story several times since, so I grew up hearing it. We were going on a trip to see my grandma for 2 weeks surrounding Christmas, so my mum and stepdad threw me and my brother in the van and hit the road. My grandma was living about 9 hours away, and the trip is never the safest in the world, and worse yet during winter. Getting to her involved driving on steep winding mountain roads with hairpin turns and sheer drops with no guardrail to speak of, in an old crappy van, in Canadian winter. I feel like my parents were being very optimistic, in thinking the van would make the trip. But it didn't. In the middle of nowhere in a heavy blizzard, the rolling turd broke down. Stepdad, Dad henceforth, I'm lazy and see him as Dad anyway, managed to limp it 3/4 out of the way of potential traffic, somewhere not too steep, and Mum used her 1 bar of cell reception to call CAA. After that, there was nothing to do but sit. In a place so rural, there's not a lot of traffic on the road, and especially not in December, in a storm. So no help came that way. They dressed us in our full winter gear and held us in their laps, just trying to keep us warm. They've explained to us since that they were fairly bricking it at that point. It was cold, getting dark, and we had hardly anything left to eat or drink, and they had a 6- and 3-year-old to keep alive. Yikes. It was really starting to get black out, when my mum said something like, "What if nobody comes? What if they can't find us?" to my dad. And apparently I pepped right up in her arms and said, "Don't worry, Mummy, Michael is coming." They've told me they thought I meant Michael the Archangel, we were raised Catholic, and that he was coming to save us, and was just trying to be reassuring in that little kid way. They smiled at me and thanked me for being brave. But not 2 minutes later, the only other vehicle to come down the road since we'd broken down, rounded the bend and cut through the dark with head beams landing on us. The tow truck CAA had sent for us came, pulling up beside us, and my parents left my brother and I in the van and jumped out to meet it. The guy driving the tow truck jumped out into the snow, reached to shake my dad's hand and said, "Hi there, folks. I'm with the CAA, here to help. My name is Michael." I was a 6-year-old child. CAA call service hadn't told my parents who would be responding to their call. And of course, we didn't know this guy. And yet, somehow, I knew Michael was coming. I just want to clarify from the start that I don't really have any evidence for any of the things I'm about to list, besides the vouching of my family, especially my sisters. They don't always believe that the incidents were paranormal, and I don't necessarily do either. That's what I'm here for. But they do believe that they happened. I'm going to be giving some preface before I actually list what's happened to me personally. I live in a house with my mum, sister, stepdad, stepsister, 2 dogs and my cat. My stepdad is a major paranormal skeptic. My sister is a little over-believing, and my mum and stepsister are mostly neutral. A lot of my family has experienced some really scary things. My grandpa has moved because of it, and it's sort of common knowledge that we can all tell if something is paranormal or not. My grandpa has had weird, terrifying things happen that he'll insist aren't paranormal at all, and some things that are slightly less scary than he'll insist were. I can generally tell if someone else is telling the truth about some experience, but for myself, I just can't tell the way they can. And I think it's partially because of my anxiety, which is constantly making my thoughts contradict themselves. Anyway, I have several seemingly disconnected incidents that I guess I can just bullet point out. They're over my entire span of living here, so I can't really remember the order. The first one. I was standing in my sister's doorway. I was leaning on the doorframe, reading over a thing she'd written for school she wanted me to look over, and the dog ran past me, kind of shoving me a little. I said, "That's rude, Mr. Sanders." The dog's name is Barry Sanders. We don't watch football. Don't ask me. A couple of seconds later, I heard my sister crying and looked up. The dog was asleep in her lap and had been the entire time, so whatever ran past me was not our dog. We can't talk about it out loud, because it still makes us choke up just how scared we were in that moment. Second incident. I was laying in bed. It was pretty dark, but I wasn't asleep yet and was just sitting on my phone waiting to get tired. I heard a really loud bang come from my closet, and my cat ran over and laid directly on my neck, which she does when either one of us gets scared. I already had Snapchat open, so I decided to start recording to see if it happened again, because I was pretty sure there were animals living in the walls, but my parents insisted they weren't that big of a deal, so I was hoping something else would happen so I could have a bit of proof that I had reason to be bothered. Unfortunately, you can't see anything in the video. There's only sound. But at the time, that didn't faze me, because all I needed was proof the animal made sounds. Instead of another noise from the closet and walls, there was a click, which you can barely make out in the video. But from my bed, I could see that it was the door handle turning. After that, the closet door swung back and forth, creaking extremely loudly, when it normally hardly does at all. I stopped because I wanted to turn the light on and immediately went to show the video to my mum. It happened another time after that. At night again, but I didn't record. I didn't feel threatened, but I did start keeping my laundry basket in front of the closet door and haven't had it happen since then. The third incident. This one is possibly the scariest because no one has ever been able to explain it in a way that matches up with the story. Me and my sisters were in the kitchen. Both parents were taking a nap and had been for about an hour. We were the only ones in that kitchen for at least the previous hour. And on the counter there were some dirty dishes. When out of nowhere, my mum's measuring cup just explodes into tiny pieces all over the kitchen. We couldn't even walk anywhere and had to yell for our parents to put on shoes and sweep the floor around us so we could go and shake the glass out of our hair and clothes. I've looked it up and found some things about Pyrex measuring cups exploding, but not to the extent that ours did. And ours was not even a Pyrex. It was a really old one, with all the measuring letters engraved so they wouldn't wash off. My grandma had given it to my mum about 3 or 4 years earlier. I was looking at different measuring cups for the sake of this post, and it was the same general look as a bread bunny, but I don't believe ours was. Fourth incident. Once, I was on the phone with a friend, and 2 things on my wall, one hung canvas and one hung glass frame. Both fell at the exact same time. That's probably the one that can be explained the most easily, and it's also the shortest, but it's still weird. Incident 5. Similar to the dog incident, we, my stepsister and I, once opened the front door to get ready to go to school, and something large and black, a little bigger than our lab, looked like it ran through the house. However, we knew it wasn't the dog, because he was already inside, and again this was bigger than him. I don't think it was the same situation as the dog incident though, because it didn't push us at all, and didn't really have a specific shape, whereas the previous one was so much like our dog. Had he been in another room when it happened, we wouldn't have ever thought about it again. But this was just sort of a black blob that appeared solid but wasn't, and by the time we turned around it was gone. There's some other smaller things, like canned goods falling over when they shouldn't, the shower curtain being open when it was almost definitely closed before, and things going missing and showing up in odd places. My family also has quite a bit of paranormal and non-paranormal disturbing backstory, if anyone might be interested in more contexts. Specifically, some things that happened when I was in my early teens, some things my grandpa said, who my stepdad bought the property from, and my family's very weird trademark of having near-death experiences and dying young, and how death follows us around in general. I really don't know if I'm looking to be proved wrong, or told that I can't be. I guess it would just be nice to get some other opinions. I've also neglected to include the door video, because as I said, it's really only audio, and I believe that was the first paranormal aligned incident I actually paid attention to, and it was over 2 years ago now. If anyone really thinks it'll help, I can try to find it, but I honestly don't think it'll provide much, since it's just the sound of a door creaking, and that could be faked pretty easily. Now, I have lived in this house with my husband and 2 teenage sons for about 2 years, and every one of us has heard the same thing, time after time. When sitting in the living room at night, you can hear what sounds like someone pacing back and forth on the front porch. Sometimes there will be a light knocking on the front door and the walls, but when we check, no one was there. There are no wild animals, nothing that could explain the noise at all, and we've kind of made a joke out of it. Oh, the ghost is back, ha. But none of us are really true paranormal believers, although I am open to the possibility. I'm just skeptical, and want to explore all options before jumping to conclusions. Well, my mother has been staying over with us for the past week, and has been sleeping on a pull-out bed in the living room. She tells me that it goes on all night long, and that it can actually get pretty intense. We are all a ways in our bedrooms at night on the opposite side of the house, so we had never really experienced what she had. But about an hour ago, my mother and I were watching a movie in the living room, about 10 p.m. where I live, and my husband had gone out, and the kids were playing Smash Bros in the back room. When we heard the pacing a few times, and talked about it a little earlier, and when there was a few minutes of quiet, there were then 3 heavy, distinct knocks on the front door that sounded just like my husband had come back. But it sounded like he had his hands full of groceries, so I reached over and opened the door for him, whilst still looking at the TV screen, and said, "You're back, come on in." But no one came in. We stopped the movie and I looked around outside, but nothing. My husband wasn't back yet, and there was no one there. My mum told me again that this happens every night, but I'd never heard it so distinctly. She then said, sort of jokingly, that she thought there was someone out there that wanted in, and I think I'd just given him an invitation. At that very moment, as soon as that proclamation had left her lips, the light bulb flickered for about 5 seconds, then blew out completely, leaving us all sitting there in the dark. We panicked for a few seconds, then tried to laugh it off. We restarted the movie we were watching, and for the rest of the movie we heard no creeping around outside. I don't want to admit it, but I'm feeling scared right now. I went to the bathroom, and one of the bulbs in there did the same little flicker, but thankfully didn't bust like the other ones. This isn't something that has happened before, and it's not a wiring problem, at least not one that existed before the incident. So yes, I do admit that this is not a very dramatic story, and I sincerely hope it doesn't become one. But I just feel like I'm constantly being watched now. I feel like something was trying to make its presence known. I know nothing about this type of occurrence, and I am hoping someone here might and can help me explain what happened and what I do next, if anything. Am I just being silly? We weren't watching a scary movie or anything, and I'm not the type to want to believe these stories are something unexplainable. But then it happens to you, and it feels a little different then. This story might not be scary or exactly ghostly, but I've been spooked since I watched a paranormal show. I come from a country in Southeast Asia, and I'm a big horror movies books fan, but I've always kept to the Western movies, because I know I'm too scared to deal with the Asian ones, because it's closer to home. And if I end up seeing ghosts, they might end up looking like that instead of wearing dresses or anything. Besides, there's one type of ghost in my country that spooks me the most, and even the mere mention of them can make me cower. Now, this paranormal show uses the spirit mediums to communicate mostly. One of the guys has the ability to see spirits, and he draws them at these locations. Most of the spirits either look like humans, a lady with long hair for example, or they look beastly. One in particular looks like a mix of a woman and animal. Lady with a long hair and a curved horn on each side of her head, and a coiling snake at the bottom. For some reason this disturbed me greatly, and I kept thinking of the homeowner's words of seeing a snake coiling around the poles that were supporting the kitchen roof, and thought it was a literal animal, but it could easily have been this ghost. It moved only through places where it could wrap around, like a literal snake. Their kitchen was also made of coffin boards, which just added to the creepiness of it. And while it's in a different area, this haunted house sits in a state I often visit, so that scared me even more. So brave old me became so spooked I couldn't sleep well, and kept imagining ghosts around me. Now I work the night shift while everyone's asleep, and I don't know if this was fear or if it was something more, but I kept seeing something passing by from the corner of my eyes. Now that I've gotten my courage back, thankfully it's been happening less, almost never, except for the occasional one which I dismiss as a trick of the light, even when I haven't moved an inch. I dreamt I'd met the ghost that I mentioned above, not the snake lady, and I felt my mouth clamped shut in the dream, which was a scary thing. After reading religious texts, they are the only thing to defend myself, so for some reason in the dream, it showed its 2 middle fingers instead. While that last part was ridiculous, the fear in the face of the being isn't, and I won't be forgetting it anytime soon. While hunting for more of that paranormal show's podcasts, they mentioned that the drawings were put up for their exhibition, and even though it might be a different drawing to the case, one of them caused a visitor or two to be possessed. The guy said that he'd used his energy, like the other kind of energy, to draw them, and that the ghost's aura had been imprinted on it, hence the effect it has on people. I was wondering if that's the case, then could that have reached me through the screen? Or am I just being a coward? I want to preface this by saying that this is not meant to fearmonger or scare anyone. This is just something very, very rare that happened to me for a few reasons. A perfect storm of events that led to this. So don't get scared or worry about this happening to you or anyone else. Fear attracts fear, so be fearless. I'm a very skeptical person, in that I have a hard time believing people's random stories, especially on Reddit, so I understand people's skepticism, if there is any. This happened to me when I was 13 years old. I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist Christian household with 8 brothers and sisters. My parents read us the Bible every day, prayed every day, and we weren't allowed to have sugar, etc. It kinda sucked, but my parents did it because they truly thought it was the right thing, and I respect them for that. One night my dad was putting me and my 2 other brothers to bed, and as he started saying his nightly prayer for us, all of a sudden I felt something physically jump on me from behind as I was sitting up in my bed. I thought it was a cat at first, because that's exactly what it felt like. But then I felt like my body erupted into flames, and something started choking me. I freaked out and started screaming for my dad to get it off me, as all that was going through my head was that something had jumped on my back, lit me on fire, and was now strangling me. I was in complete panic mode. My dad thought I was joking and told me to stop, and was even threatening to ground me. My brothers were terrified from my screaming and rolling around like I was on fire. I ripped my shirt off, thinking it was in flames, and it was so painful, and I couldn't escape it. My mum and sisters heard me screaming and came running into my room. My dad told her I was faking it. Then my mum told me to stop joking around. I was so confused, because I genuinely felt something weighing on me as I burned alive, and I couldn't breathe. I was desperate for them to believe me. I then ran out of my room to go look in a mirror, because I couldn't believe my parents didn't see what was on me. And when I got to the mirror, I saw my body and throat covered in scratches, really visible scratches, like raised cat scratches, and my body was all red, like I had bad sunburn. Now some of the scratches could have been from me rolling around and trying to rip off what I thought was on me, but most were deep, raised scratches, and there were dozens on me all over my body and neck. When my parents saw these, they freaked out. Now they believed me. They immediately thought demon and started to pray. It was some prayer like, "In the name of Jesus, blah blah blah." But I then felt like I had to throw up. My mum ran and grabbed a soup pot from the kitchen, and I threw up into it. It burned so bad coming up, but I immediately felt like the weight was off me. I wasn't on fire, and I could breathe again. I was crying, absolutely exhausted, terrified, and so confused. I truly thought I was going to be killed by something I couldn't see. The weird thing about the throwing up part was that it looked like pure oil and water mixed together, nothing else. I know it's gross, but there was nothing that looked like regular puke, food chunks or whatever. It also smelled so bad, like burning sulfur. Of course my parents and I thought it was a demonic attack, and they blamed me, making me get rid of my Jurassic Park toys. Somehow they thought Jurassic Park was evil. However, I do not believe it was a demonic attack now, and I don't believe in them, ironically. I think I found out what it was years later, but I'm not sure if I want to get into it here. It involves some stuff that is pretty personal, so I'll leave it for now. But I don't think there was a natural or physical explanation either, like an allergic reaction to something, mainly because it immediately went away after my parents started praying. I'm allergic to bees, and when I got stung when I was a kid, it almost killed me. But the bee sting experience was totally different and more extreme. Now, I have always been a non-believer, and I still am. But in the last few years, some things have happened that I really can't explain. And recently, some of them have also started happening to people around me. Since I've been a teen, I've witnessed quite a lot of bizarre things, and I think I've become so used to them that unless they are obvious, I don't really notice them. For years I've suffered with sleep paralysis. I'm generally a very calm person, and it got to the point where it was so frequent that I started testing how fast I could snap out of it. Even if it happened, which it hasn't for some years, I am usually able to snap out of it in less than 20 to 30 seconds. I should also mention that I am an extremely light sleeper, so much so that even birds chirping combined with a glimmer of sunlight will wake me up. The first time I saw what I think was a shadow person was when I was 18. It was the middle of the day and I was at home, and later on that night around 3 a.m, I'm not sure, it was 5+ years ago, I woke up with a really strange feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to go back to sleep, but it felt like the thing that was watching me was now behind me, creeping closer and closer. I ignored it despite the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, until it felt that whatever it was right behind me. At that point I heard the light switch being clicked, and I barely opened my right eye, pretending to be asleep. When I saw the light was on, my brain released a dose of adrenaline that I haven't experienced since. Not even close. My house is basically the only one in the neighborhood, and it's never been robbed or broken into, although they've tried a couple of times. But I made sure to scare them off for good. And since my room was one of the 2 easiest access points, I always slept with my old broken hockey sticks next to me, just in case I ever needed them. This time, however, I had no time for that. In one motion, I jumped up onto my bed, whilst throwing my bedsheets over where I thought this intruder would be, which was just behind me, and close to the light switch. When the blankets were flying, for a split second I saw this black silhouette of a person. It was completely black, but with a clear outline, and looked like a 2D person. No facial features, except a white space that resembled a grin, and hair like Lisa Simpson, only longer, roughly 30 to 40 centimeters, and was pointing in every direction. As I jumped up, I was basically at eye level with this thing, if it had any, and based from my height, 2.02 meters, and the fact that I was still on the bed, that thing should have been at least 2.3, 2.4, without counting the hair. As soon as the blankets started falling from it, they fell to the ground between us like nothing was ever there. I was so shocked I stayed there for 20 seconds, trying to process what had just happened. I then took my hockey stick, did a full sweep of my room, and all doors and windows were locked. I went outside my room, did a full sweep of the house, and found that no door had been left unlocked, and the alarm was working. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Another encounter I had was in the middle of the night a couple of years afterwards. I was taking my girlfriend home at 3 to 4 a.m. because her mother wouldn't let her stay at my place. So we'd go to bed early so we could hop in the car and I could drive her home before her mother would wake up. As we were driving along the road, it was a full moon and there was great visibility. You could have driven without lights if you let your eyes adapt. So driving along in the right lane, I live in Italy. On my right there was this huge field, which sits empty most of the year, as during the summer they sell lots of trees and place them to make something akin to a plant showroom. So it's neatly kept all the year round. And that's when I saw something huge, running down this field and coming towards the road, whilst passing in front of some spotlights that a house on the edge of the field had. It was quite a bit taller than the first one at 2.8 to 3 meters, and it was 3D and was very buff. Imagine a Bigfoot, only completely black and with no fur, moving almost as fast as a hockey player on skates. I saw it, fixed my eyes on it, and it seemed to notice me. It stopped in about 4 to 5 meters away and looked towards us. Then it sped away, going back the way it had come, even faster than before. My girlfriend was sleeping at the time, but I had to pull over because I really couldn't believe what I had just seen, and I felt like I needed to cry. I've absolutely no idea what it could have been, as there are no cryptids in my country that would resemble anything like what I saw. Also at the time, I had no idea what a cryptid even was. My girlfriend later told me about them, when I told her what I'd seen that night. We looked into it, but still have no clue as to what it might have been. The last encounter I wanted to share was not witnessed by me directly, but by one of my flatmates, and it's the reason why I'm writing this. She'd never experienced anything like this, and it was the first time people that with no prior history of it had told me about it. Basically, she approached me one morning, asking me what I was doing in their room in the middle of the night. She shared it with another girl, and I told her that I had no clue what she was talking about, and that I had slept like a rock all night. She then seemed quite freaked out, so I asked her to tell me what had happened, and she told me that she'd woken up in the middle of the night to someone standing in the middle of the room staring down at her. She said she first thought the other girl was sleepwalking and standing on her bed or something, but she was out for the night and hadn't come back until after we had done talking the next day. She described the figure as being pretty buff, roughly 2.5 meters tall, and she said it was completely black and she could only make it out because it was blacker than the rest of the room, which was pitch black as well. She said that it was pretty unsettling, so she just faked being asleep and pulled her cover over her face. As a joke, I told her she'd finally met Buh, which is something my girlfriend and I started calling this thing. We got the name from a strange thing that happened with a radio, but that's for another time. And I told her about the other two occurrences I have spoken about before. She said she didn't believe it, but since she was highly suggestible, me and another flatmate decided to joke around a bit. I told this girl that I was able to speak to Buh in a lucid dream, and it told me he was going to prove to her that it was real. The plan was to plant the photo of a guy she'd said kinda resembled the figure that she'd seen in her bed, but we were quite obvious about it. We intended to just lighten up the mood and make her forget about the situation, so we could all have a good laugh about it. But the day after we pranked her, I was the only one home and was playing at my PC when I heard a lot of noise coming from the bathroom. I thought nothing of it, since I know a lot of people here are clumsy and would let their shampoo fall whilst they were showering. But what had actually happened was that her entire bathroom cabinet compartment had collapsed for no apparent reason. I was the only one home for the whole day. That night I asked her what had happened, and she showed me that the plastic inserts that held up her shelf looked like they had been cut off. I have no idea what this thing might be. I don't really believe it to be anything at all, probably just coincidences. Although the last episode made me think there might be more to it. So I came here to ask for any opinions. Based on the description I have found online, the things I have seen seem to resemble shadow people, but I am not really knowledgeable on the paranormal. Any idea what it might be? Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.